The sound of engines breaks the silence of dawn. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, military trucks roll down narrow streets, tires crunching over gravel, their headlights cutting through the early morning mist. At 7 a.m., most families are still waking up, children rubbing their eyes, women preparing morning meals, shopkeepers opening wooden stalls. But on this morning, the city feels different, tense, expectant. Inside the presidential compound, a young officer walks quickly across the hall. His boots echo on the marble floor. He carries a folder, heavy with documents and satellite images. He stops before Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 37-year-old leader of Burkina Faso. The officer opens the file. What Traoré sees makes his blood run cold. Surveillance equipment hidden in so-called development projects. Telecom companies quietly rerouting national communications. Foreign servers holding the personal data of millions of African citizens. For months, people whispered that Africa was still being treated as someone else's playground. That morning, Traoré decided the whispers would end. He gave one order. Operation Clear Sight begins in 2 hours. No leaks, no delays, no mercy. Some looked like ordinary office buildings with glass windows and company logos. But inside, soldiers found server rooms powerful enough to monitor an entire continent. Encrypted phones connected directly to Tel Aviv, and documents showing African resources mapped with military precision. This was not just a raid. It was the opening shot in what Traoré himself would later call a war for digital sovereignty. A battle not fought with tanks or missiles, but with information, networks, and control over Africa's future. So here is the question we all must ask. Was this the birth of a new African doctrine, or a gamble too dangerous for one young captain to survive? The file that landed on Traoré's desk 3 weeks earlier was not just another intelligence report. It was the smoking gun. For years, rumors circulated that African data was being siphoned abroad, but few leaders dared to act. The documents revealed something far worse than speculation. Satellite images marked with red grids showed mineral-rich zones across Burkina Faso mapped with astonishing precision. These were not the products of geological surveys for development. They were military-grade maps, tied directly to companies with Israeli ownership. Financial records showed how money flowed quietly through shell corporations registered in Europe, then funneled into telecom startups and NGOs in West Africa. Communication intercepts revealed that these entities were not only collecting African data, but transmitting it in real time to servers outside the continent. The scale was staggering. Over 2 million Burkina citizens' personal information had already been catalogued. Call logs, biometric scans, even government meeting transcripts had found their way into foreign databases. One entry in the report chilled Traoré most. A list of encrypted communications between these companies and Western intelligence agencies, including France, Britain, and even the United States. This was not just Israel acting alone. It was a consortium of powers treating Africa as a silent marketplace for information extraction. That night, Traoré did not sleep. His advisors warned him of the risks: international backlash, sanctions, possible destabilization. But the young captain, who had risen to power in 2022 by defying odds, saw no choice. "If we allow them to continue," he reportedly told his inner circle, "then sovereignty is nothing but a word in a speech." On that Thursday morning, he summoned his commanders. Phones were placed in a secure vault. Orders were handwritten, not typed. Secrecy was absolute. Operation Clear Sight, he declared, will remove the blindfold from Africa's eyes. The first target was a sleek office building with tinted glass windows. To passers-by, it looked like a telecom firm. Inside, soldiers discovered racks of servers linked to satellite uplinks. One server alone contained metadata from half the country's mobile users. Soldiers boxed hard drives, pulled cables, and sealed evidence. Simultaneously, across the capital, 16 more sites were hit. Some were hidden inside humanitarian organizations. Others in technology hubs funded by Western donors. At one site, encrypted phones were still buzzing with incoming messages from Tel Aviv. At another, surveillance drones sat in crates labeled agricultural research equipment. The camouflage was clever, but not clever enough. By 9 a.m., Operation Clear Sight had dismantled an entire network. No shots fired, no blood spilled, just a quiet but decisive show of discipline. At noon, Captain Traoré stepped in front of cameras, wearing his fatigues, calm and deliberate. He said only one line that echoed across the continent. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are not your test subjects. We are not your blind spot. Within hours, African news outlets replayed the footage endlessly. Social media feeds exploded with hashtags, Africa not for sale, and digital sovereignty. In marketplaces, students quoted his line, mothers said they finally felt someone was defending their dignity. But what startled the world was not Burkina Faso's action alone. It was how quickly it triggered a chain reaction. Mali froze all imports of Israeli defense technology. Guinea suspended contracts with foreign cybersecurity firms. Niger announced an audit of its infrastructure deals. Within 3 days, analysts dubbed it the West African Firewall. In Tel Aviv, panic spread. Leaked transcripts later showed Netanyahu's advisors warning that this was not about Burkina Faso anymore. It was a domino effect. One senior official reportedly said, if 2 more countries follow, our grid in West Africa collapses. The French government, usually the first to issue statements about its partners in Africa, said nothing. In Washington, the State Department called for dialogue and restraint, diplomatic language that avoided the core issue. Privately, intelligence analysts admitted they were alarmed. For ordinary Burkina-based citizens, however, the mood was celebratory. Crowds gathered outside the presidential compound. Young men waved flags. Women sang traditional songs. Homemade signs read, our data, our choice, and Africa is not for sale. One local radio host captured the mood. He didn't just expel spies. He expelled our silence. Was it simply patriotism? Or did he believe he was laying the foundation for a new doctrine? The international reaction was swift, but divided. In Tel Aviv, emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was briefed by shaken intelligence chiefs. They admitted that not only had their operations in Burkina Faso been compromised, but evidence suggested similar facilities existed in Mali, Guinea, and Niger. One advisor warned bluntly, Mr. Prime Minister, he is building a wall against us. If this spreads, we lose the entire Sahel. Headlines accused Captain Traoré of destabilizing the region, threatening democracy, and aligning with authoritarian partners. Yet, those narratives failed to catch fire outside Israel. On the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands celebrated. In Bamako and Conakry, young activists marched with signs declaring, Africa is awake, and no more digital colonization. The State Department released a short statement calling for dialogue and restraint. But behind closed doors, analysts at AFRICOM and the CIA were unsettled. For decades, Africa had been a quiet arena for intelligence gathering. Suddenly, a young officer had pulled back the curtain. An internal memo later leaked described Operation Clear Sight as a potential model for anti-Western counterintelligence in Africa. French officials were torn. If they condemned Traoré, they risked proving his accusations correct. If they said nothing, they appeared powerless. For the first time in decades, France, the self-proclaimed guardian of West Africa, had no words. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré's government moved with remarkable discipline. No mobs looted the offices. No soldiers fired shots. Equipment was catalogued, boxed, and stored under military guard. State television aired images of confiscated servers and crates labeled agricultural equipment filled with drones. Citizens saw with their own eyes what had been hidden in plain sight. And then came the unexpected. By the 3rd day, leaders from Mali, Guinea, and Niger were not just freezing contracts. They were coordinating. Intelligence officers held secret meetings in Bamako to compare notes. Within a week, the 3 countries began drafting what they called the West African Firewall Initiative, a joint effort to identify and dismantle foreign surveillance networks. What began as a Burkina Faso operation was turning into a regional doctrine. The reaction from ordinary Africans was electric. In marketplaces, Radio hosts compared Traoré to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated decades earlier for daring to defy foreign powers. Young people painted murals with slogans like "Our data, our power," and "Africa for Africans." In Ghana, Nigeria, and even South Africa, students demanded their governments investigate foreign telecom contracts. The global press, however, was slow to respond. Mainstream outlets in Europe and America framed the story narrowly. Another strongman seizing control, another risk to stability. But African diaspora media told it differently. On YouTube, podcasts, and social media, the narrative was clear. This was a moment of liberation, a digital Independence Day. Even within Israel, cracks appeared. Some commentators admitted that Netanyahu's African policy had been reckless, relying on secrecy and assuming compliance. A leaked editorial draft from an Israeli think tank warned, if African nations embrace digital sovereignty, our intelligence infrastructure collapses. His critics warned that exposing foreign interference might provoke retaliation, sanctions, cyber attacks, or worse. Yet in those first weeks, his gamble seemed to pay off. Burkina Faso did not descend into chaos. Instead, schools, churches, and mosques held gatherings where citizens prayed for protection and thanked their leader for defending national dignity. The climax of that first week came on Saturday night. As crowds gathered outside the presidential compound, fireworks lit the sky. A student climbed a lamppost waving a handmade banner that read, "He expelled spies. He expelled our silence." The crowd roared in approval, but not everyone was celebrating. In Washington, AFRICOM Commander General Michael Langley testified before the Senate, warning that Traoré was using nationalism to entrench his junta and that gold revenues could be diverted to strengthen his regime. His words sparked outrage across African diaspora communities, who flooded social media with the hashtag #HandsOffAES, referring to the Alliance of Sahel states. Protests erupted in New York, Chicago, and London, where thousands marched in solidarity with Traoré. For the first time, a leader from a small West African country had sparked demonstrations not just in Africa, but across the Atlantic. The message was simple. Africans and their descendants would no longer stay silent while their continent was treated as a laboratory. And so, the question shifted. This was no longer just about servers in Ouagadougou. It was about whether the world was prepared to face an Africa that demanded digital sovereignty. Would foreign powers adapt to this new reality, or would they try to crush it before it spread? The ripple effects of Operation Clear Sight were not limited to speeches and headlines. They touched daily life across Burkina Faso and soon across West Africa. Families who once worried that their phone calls were monitored now felt a new sense of dignity. University students began organizing workshops on digital sovereignty, a term that was almost unheard of in Africa just months earlier. Teachers told their pupils that safeguarding information was as important as guarding borders. Yet alongside pride came anxiety. Would retaliation follow? Local shopkeepers whispered about sanctions. Farmers feared that international aid might be cut. For decades, many African economies had been tied to Western development contracts. Breaking that pattern was bold, but it came with risks. Within weeks, prices of imported goods rose slightly as some European firms paused shipments, pending review. But something unexpected happened too. Regional trade increased. Trucks from Mali and Guinea brought food and fuel into Burkina Faso, bypassing French middlemen. Citizens began to see what Pan-African solidarity might look like in practice. Migration patterns also shifted. Instead of young people leaving in despair, some Burkinabe living abroad began returning, inspired by the promise of a nation reclaiming control. A young software engineer who had been working in Dakar told reporters, "If my government defends my data, maybe I can defend my skills at home." For years, brain drain had crippled Africa's development. Operation Clear Sight hinted at a reversal. Politically, the impact was seismic. The African Union, usually cautious and slow to act, held a private meeting in Addis Ababa. For the first time, member states discussed a continental strategy to regulate foreign digital infrastructure. One delegate reportedly said, "If we cannot protect our information, we are not nations. We are only clients." They warned of a new authoritarianism in West Africa. Yet even critics admitted that he had exposed something real: foreign surveillance hidden under the cover of development. A French journalist wrote reluctantly, "Whatever we think of his methods, Captain Traoré has forced a conversation we avoided for too long." American companies had billions invested in African telecom and tech. More importantly, US. Counterterrorism strategies relied heavily on intelligence flows from the Sahel. If African leaders cut off or restricted that flow, Washington feared blind spots in its global security map. Pentagon analysts quietly debated, should the US adapt by offering transparent partnerships or double down on covert operations? Back in Burkina Faso, civil society began to reshape itself. Women's groups held rallies under the slogan, "Our children deserve privacy." Church leaders preached about dignity and truth, framing digital sovereignty as a moral cause. Muslim clerics, too, spoke of protecting the innocent from unseen control. For once, religious leaders of different faiths shared the same message. Africa's independence was not just material, but spiritual. The economic front brought both challenges and opportunities. Cutting ties with some Israeli-linked companies slowed certain projects, but alternative offers poured in. China proposed building new fiber optic lines under African oversight. Russia offered cybersecurity training programs. India pledged to invest in data centers inside Africa. These offers raised new questions. Could Africa accept outside help without falling into new traps? Ordinary citizens were not naive. On the streets, taxi drivers debated whether Chinese transparency would last. Farmers asked if Russian training came with hidden strings. Yet the difference was that for the first time, these questions were being asked openly. Sovereignty was no longer abstract. It was dinner table talk. Perhaps the most profound effect was psychological. For generations, Africans had been told their nations were too weak to resist global powers. Operation Clear Sight broke that narrative. A grandmother in Ouagadougou summed it up simply, "They thought we were blind, but our eyes are open." Cyber attacks on Burkina Faso's government website spiked within a month, targeting ministries and banks. Officials blamed foreign actors, though no government admitted involvement. Western diplomats quietly hinted that foreign aid might be reduced if Traoré did not moderate his policies. For many Burkinabés, this confirmed what they already suspected. Standing up for sovereignty carried a cost. The deeper question now extended beyond Burkina Faso. If digital sovereignty became the norm, how would that reshape Africa's place in the global order? Would the US see it as a threat or an opportunity to reset its relationship with the continent on more equal terms? And for ordinary Americans, especially those who remembered the Cold War, the developments carried echoes. Was Africa becoming the next great arena of competition, not for territory, but for information? And if so, how would the US respond when its own security strategies were challenged by a young captain in a small landlocked country? In Washington, policymakers faced a dilemma. To ignore Burkina Faso risked emboldening other African nations to follow suit. To retaliate risked confirming Traoré's accusations of foreign interference. For weeks, the State Department debated whether to frame the issue as a security concern or a development challenge. In reality, it was both. America's counterterrorism operations depended on the very networks that Traoré had exposed. Losing access meant blind spots in regions where extremist groups were active. On Capitol Hill, hearings grew tense. Some lawmakers demanded sanctions, warning that Russia and China were stepping into the vacuum. Others argued that America needed a new approach, partnership based on transparency rather than covert advantage. A veteran senator asked aloud, "If Africans are demanding digital sovereignty, do we want to be the country that resists it or the one that helps shape it?" France, still reeling from declining influence in the Sahel, hesitated to speak. Germany quietly opened talks with West African governments, offering technical cooperation under full transparency. Even Britain, once deeply tied to surveillance networks, signaled that it was willing to adapt to African-led standards. Russia praised Burkina Faso for defending sovereignty against neo-colonialism. China offered partnerships that included audits and joint oversight committees. India announced it would help African countries build data centers under local control. For the first time in decades, global powers were competing not to dictate terms, but to prove their respect for African rules. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré watched these shifts carefully. He reminded his people that alliances must serve African interests first. "We will work with anyone," he said, "but never again at the price of our dignity." It was a demand for fairness, and for Washington the choice was clear but difficult. Adapt to an Africa that insists on sovereignty, or watch other powers fill the space. The question hanging over the world was simple. Was this crisis a passing storm, or the beginning of a permanent realignment? 6 months after Operation Clear Sight, the dust had not settled. Burkina Faso stood more defiant, and the Sahel more restless than at any point in recent memory. Internet costs were lower, speeds faster, and confidence higher. Yet the threats circling the nation were real. Cyber attacks continued against banks and ministries. Rumors spread that covert operations might be relaunched under new disguises. Western diplomats hinted that sanctions were under discussion. "We are not at war with the world," he said, "but we are at war with the idea that Africa must always be watched, measured, and controlled by outsiders." His words resonated not just in Burkina Faso, but in Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond. The demand for digital sovereignty was no longer a fringe idea. It had become a continental rallying cry. Looking ahead 30 to 90 days, analysts saw two possibilities. The optimistic scenario: African nations coordinate under the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework, attracting new partners while keeping surveillance at bay. The darker scenario: external powers intensify pressure, seeking to fracture the alliance through sanctions, propaganda, or covert destabilization.